do?
I suppose it does complicate things a bit, just as if you were a white European in the 18th century, it probably complicated things to have to consider the interests of Africans, which interferes with your profitable trade in slaves maybe. But even though it's more complicated, it's still something we ought to do. Now, it is true that the calculations can't be done with any precision at all, but I think that we can have some situations where we can make rough comparisons and where it's pretty clear that we're inflicting more suffering than is justified by the benefit we're getting out of it. And I would say one of those examples is factory farming. In factory farming, we confine animals in conditions that really, for their entire lives, make them miserable. They can't satisfy their basic needs, neither physically in terms of moving around, exercising, having comfortable bedding, nor socially and psychologically in terms of mixing with the right kind of social groups that's suited for their species. Laying hens might be suffering for their entire lives more than a year or so. Breeding sows might be in stalls for also pretty much their entire lives. And then you have to say, well, what do we get out of this? Well, we produce food a little more cheaply. I don't think that there's much doubt that that's not something that could be justified if we give equal consideration to the sufferings of the hens or the pigs.
But isn't that just an argument for eating free-range meat rather than factory-farmed meat?
It's an argument that says a clear-cut case is factory farming, and if you want to have something that you can say pretty much definitely is not justified because it exploits animals wrongly, then factory farming is the clearest case. That's not to say that if you get into other forms of farming, you may not still find things that are undesirable that we do to animals, and you might still reasonably come to the conclusion that we shouldn't be doing that. But it's certainly not as open and shut or black and white a case as it is with factory farming.
And presumably if you go down to eating game, animals that have lived in the wild that have been killed very quickly with a gunshot perhaps, that presumably is more morally acceptable than eating free-range meat which has to be taken to be slaughtered.
I think that's generally true. Yes, it will perhaps depend on the particulars and how good a shot you are and how reliably you can put a bullet through the brain of the moving animal and kill it instantly rather than have it wounded and escaping or something like that. But if you are a good shot, it's better to go hunting for your animal certainly than to go down to the supermarket for it.
See, what I like about what you're saying is it's so reasoned. Everything is consistent. You're looking for an argument that makes distinctions based on not how you feel about killing or animal suffering, but about what the implications are rationally. Most people that I've met who are vegetarians have a complete sense of revulsion about eating meat or harming animals in any way that they might not be able to justify rationally. Perhaps they're not moral vegetarians.
Some of them, I suppose, could be aesthetic vegetarians. That is, they are repulsed by the idea of killing an animal. And I agree in a way there is something that does repel me about it, even if I convince myself by the argument we were just having that if you have, say, deer that are reproducing and there's no predators and so on, and they will die in winter from lack of food and they will die a slower death and therefore it's okay to shoot them. Even if I were to convince myself of that, I still wouldn't like the idea of watching that beautiful animal suddenly drop dead and be reduced to a carcass and a piece of meat. But speaking as a moral philosopher, I do have to really consider whether this is just a kind of a yuck response of the sort that we might have to other things that actually are quite defensible or justifiable, or whether there's a serious ethical reason for not doing it.
So do you believe that we should all be vegetarians?
Almost all, I would say. If there is someone who is living a traditional indigenous life, whether it's Eskimo who survive in a traditional way by killing fish or something like that, or Australian Aboriginals who are still living a traditional life that might involve occasionally killing some animals, I would not presume to say to them, you have to abandon this life and go and live in a city where you can earn money and buy your food in the supermarket. I think maybe that's a somewhat different situation.
So in a sense, those who aren't vegetarians are immoral to a degree, and I'm trying to get an idea of just how immoral is it to eat meat?
Compared to what, I suppose, is what I would say to that. Yes, I think it's morally wrong. None of us are perfect, I guess. I don't consider that everything that I do is perfect. So I'm not really going around stoning people for not doing the right thing, but I think part of living a morally good life should be having concern for the consequences of what you do, having concern for animals who are affected by your actions. And I think those things do say that you'd be living a better life if you were a vegetarian.
For me, that's a very classical conception of philosophy, that you don't just think it, you live it.
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't be still doing moral philosophy if I thought it was just theoretical games. You know, when I was a teenager, I was very much fascinated by chess, and I used to spend time looking at chess problems, white to move and mate in two, all that sort of thing. Great fun. It's great intellectual stimulation. It's a fascinating thing, but I wouldn't want to spend my life doing it. There must be things that are more important. And sometimes I think people doing philosophy almost reduce it to the level of solving the chess puzzle.
Now, I live in Oxford, where there's a large building just been built specifically to do research on animals. That's another way in which animals are frequently used that causes them suffering, but that's defended in terms of the outcome. There are other ways of surviving because you can be a vegetarian, but how could you do medical research without doing animal experimentation?
There's quite a lot of medical research, of course, that is done without doing animal experimentation. A lot of medical research is done through trials with humans, and we've also greatly increased the amount of research we can do using tissue cultures, various things like that, partly as a result of pressure from the animal movement. But I'm not going to say that there's nothing where we could learn something from medical research.
So you're not an absolutist. You think there are situations in which it could be morally acceptable to use non-human animals for the benefit of human beings?
It could be. I certainly couldn't rule that out as a theoretical possibility, but I would have a very high bar to be cleared before you could go ahead and do that. And one of the reasons I would have a very high bar is that I think the whole institutional practice of research on animals has grown up with that speciesist prejudice that I mentioned before, that animals really don't count or really don't matter very much, and therefore if we want to find something out, it's not a problem to say, get me 50 rats or get me 20 dogs. So that's why I don't want to justify the general practice of animal experimentation, and I certainly don't want to justify or defend what happens in the building that you described that I know has been very controversial in Oxford, because I suspect that what's going on there is that scientists are carrying on their business as usual, in which the interests of the animals are not given anything like the weight that the interests of humans at comparable mental levels would be.
When you started writing about the suffering of animals, speciesism and so on, that was a very radical position to take. Things have evolved since then. There are many more people who go along with your reasoning. Do you think that there's going to be a time in the future when people will look back and say, I can't believe they were eating meat. I can't believe they did experiments on chimpanzees?
I hope so. At least I hope they'll say, I can't believe they were locking animals up in factory farms so that they didn't have room to walk around or even to turn around. And I do hope they'll say, I can't believe the things that people were doing to chimpanzees. In fact, we've almost got to that point now, really, with chimpanzees, that you look back, on some of the things that were done not that long ago, 20 or 30 years ago, and people are quite horrified that those experiments were permitted. So we are making progress. I very much hope that we'll continue to do so.
Peter Singer, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel. It's been good talking to you.
Ethics Bites was produced in association with the Open University. You can listen to more Ethics Bites on open2.net, where you'll also find supporting material. Or you can visit www.philosophybites.com to hear more philosophy podcasts.